After reading Marcion's Antitheses, one might get the impression that Marcion's hostility toward the Judean Lord meant hostility toward the Jewish people. But such is not the case. In fact, Marcion's enemy Tertullian accused the Pontian of aligning himself with Jewish ideology and interpretation, since he believed in the coming of a Jewish political Messiah, and he interpreted Jewish prophecies literally. In fact, it was because of this very accusation that the German historian Adolf von Harnack thought Marcion was himself born Jewish or had at one time become a Jewish proselyte. And recent scholars have adapted this theory. Marcion's interpretation of the Jewish Messiah may indeed have been influenced by Jewish interpretation. His interpretation is at least significant because no other Christian was even willing to concede that the Jewish concept of their own Messiah was correct. They almost always said that the Jews were wrong about how they envisioned their Messiah, and that this error led to a failure to recognize Jesus. At the same time, Marcion's acceptance of an independent Jewish Messiah is not a strong reason for thinking that Marcion himself was Jewish or a one-time convert to Judaism. Whatever we glean from reading the Antitheses, it is that Marcion knew the Hebrew scriptures well. He had read a range of Jewish scriptures, and he had an eye for detail. In itself, this is not evidence that Marcion was raised a Jew, or that he turned against his pious Jewish way of reading scripture when he became a Christian. All this is speculation. All we know is that by the time he wrote the Antitheses, Marcion was reading Jewish scripture in a Christian way, and his Christian reading was not against the Jews per se, but against their Lord. In my view, Marcion was not the creator of a new religion called Christianity, a religion separate from the practices and institutions of Judaism. No, the distinct religion called Christianity, as we call it, already existed and is attested in early 2nd century documents like the Ignatian epistles, the Apologist Aristides, the preaching of Peter, the Epistle to Diognetus. Marcion lived in an era and in an area in which many Christians felt that they needed to dissociate from Judaism for both theological and political reasons. In the early 130s, Jewish radicals had tried to free Palestine from Roman domination using the brutal techniques of war. Rome lost many men in this war and expended great resources to put down what we now call the Bar Kokhba revolt. In the 140s and 150s, the Jewish people were still recovering their reputation in the eyes of Rome. Judaism may have been seen as an old and venerable religion at the time, but these sentiments were mitigated by the widespread view that Jews themselves were impious and rebellious. During this time, it was still felt to be socially advantageous for Christians to disassociate themselves from actual Jewish synagogues, Jewish rites like Sabbath and circumcision, and distinctively Jewish scriptures. Of course, Gentile Christians never managed to completely divorce themselves from Jewish traditions, and practically they could not. Their religion had grown out of a larger Jewish matrix, and both Jesus and Paul were Jewish. Christians, whether or not they were aware of it, continued in the traditions of Jewish theology, liturgy, and scriptural interpretation, even if they renounced Judaism and Gentile Judaizing movements. Marcion was one of these Christians. He was not, it seems, anti-Jewish, at least not any more than other Christians of his time. He obviously did not have an allergic reaction to things Jewish in his Bible. At the same time, he understood that his religion, the quote unquote new covenant, based on trust and love, had moved beyond the practice and traditions of Torah, and that anyone trying to tie the gospel to Jewish practice was, in his view, misled. In this regard, Marcion probably viewed himself as in continuity with Paul, continuing Paul's legacy of opposing false brethren and false Judaic leaders who were bent on making Christianity a form of Judaism, or a sort of second phase of Judaism, ever dependent on Jewish cultural traditions and texts. Marcion did not reject Jewish scripture as such, he rejected it as Christian scripture. As it stood, however, the Hebrew Bible had much to reveal about the Hebrew deity, the history of Israel, and, to a certain extent, the history of humankind. Far from showing a lack of interest in the Jewish scriptures, Marcion made full use of them as historical and theological documents. His intense usage belies the claim that he obviously hated the Old Testament. How could Marcion have hated the Old Testament if his Bible said, "The law is holy, and the commandment holy, just, and good"? Lee Martin MacDonald claims that, quote, Marcion's primary aim was the separation of Christian tradition from its Jewish heritage and its origin in Judaism, unquote. But Marcion did not think that Judaism was the heritage of Christianity. And practically speaking, he could not entirely separate Christian tradition from its origin in Judaism, nor did he want to, hence the fact that he left so many elements of Jewish prophecy and so many Jewish characters in his gospel. There are even more serious misconceptions about Marcion that need refutation. Marcion's rejection of the Hebrew Bible as Christian scripture did not mean that he hated Jews and everything Jewish, nor did he establish an anti-Jewish religion. Even more extreme and false are David Dungan's claim that Marcion removed all Jewish elements from the Christian religion, and in so doing carried out an ethnic cleansing of Christianity. Dungan asserts that Marcion preached a quote-unquote hate-filled message and that he had an anti-Jewish agenda. Such views, in addition to being wrong, attribute too much power to Marcion by making him the founder of an alternative religion. Marcion did not actively strive against the Jewish people. His battle was against Judaizing Christians, most of whom were Gentile. Marcion did not attack the Jews in any surviving report. Rather, he attacked their Lord. One could infer that an attack on the Judean Lord was an attack on the Jews themselves. But this would be a poor inference. A better inference might be that Marcion's attack on the Jewish Lord implied an attack on Judaism. That may well be. But being anti-Judaism, as virtually all early Catholic writers were, was not the same as being anti-Jewish. Given surviving evidence, we cannot determine Marcion's attitude toward flesh and blood Jews. Yet recall that Tertullian considered Marcion to be allied with the Jews and Jewish interpretation. If Tertullian knew that Marcion was anti-Jewish, he would not have been able to make this argument. Even if Marcion was not anti-Jewish, he was not pro-Jewish either. Marcion's Bible still contained comments that the law and the prophets had ceased, and that the Jews had killed the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 2:15. Thus, to try and distinguish between Marcion's alter Judaism and broader Catholic anti-Judaism may not in the end satisfy. Marcion adopted the supersessionism of his Christian colleagues. The worship of Christ was better than the religion practiced in the synagogues, according to Marcion, and Gentiles, if they wish to be saved, ought not to practice Jewish rites. In these respects, Marcion was in full agreement with early Catholics. But Marcion's position was different from the early Catholic position. S.G. Wilson puts it colorfully, quote, "The Marcionite said to the Jew, 'Keep your God, your scriptures, your Messiah, and your law.' We consider them to be inferior, superseded in every way by the gospel. The Catholic said, 'We'll take your God, your Messiah, your scriptures, and some of your law. As for you, you are disinherited, cast into a limbo, and your survival serves only as a warning of the consequences of obdurate wickedness.'" Unquote. To conclude, Marcion was an enemy to the Judean Lord, but not of the Jews themselves. Marcion's views imply anti-Judaism, but in this respect, he was no different from early Catholics, who were arguably more anti-Jewish than Marcion, since they felt the need to claim ownership of the Hebrew Scriptures. Marcion's own stance toward Jewish Scripture may have been informed by Jewish interpretations. He felt no need to appropriate Jewish signs and symbols for Christianity. By rejecting the Hebrew Scriptures as Christian Scriptures, Marcion helped Christians, at least in his community, take one more step in the long and tangled process of separating Jewish and Christian theology and modes of worship. But Marcion never had the interest in denying or the power to deny Christianity's Jewish roots.